Everyone, and namaskar to all. So first of all, I welcome Dr. Kunal Sen, uh, who has joined with us, and then who has kindly agreed to deliver the 16th Professor Baidyanath Misra Endowment Lecture. And to preside over this meeting, I invite the President of Odisha Economic Association, Dr. Jugal Kishore Mahapatra. He's the former Chief Secretary of Odisha and an alumnus of Delhi School of Economics. And I also welcome Professor Keshav Das, the former President of Odisha Economic Association and the Editor-in-Chief of Odisha Economic Journal. And I also welcome Dr. Basant Misra, the eldest son of Professor Baidyanath Misra. I think you can see him. He's probably in the hospital, and he's a neurosurgeon. He's a very famous neurosurgeon, and I also welcome all other participants and senior members of Odisha Economic Association who have joined with us. At the outset, let me tell you that usually we, like in the last few years, we used to organize this endowment lecture on the birthday of Professor Baidyanath Misra. But this time we did some deviation because of the availability of the speaker. He had very busy schedule on that day. So Professor Baidyanath Misra is born on November 22nd, 1920. Uh, so usually in last few years we have organized this endowment lecture on November 22nd, but we have advanced this lecture on this time by 1 week or by 5 days. And just to give a brief introduction of Professor Baidyanath Misra, he was born on November 22nd, 1920, and he breathed his last on May 8, 2019. And so that way, this would be actually the 103rd years, birth anniversary of Professor Baidyanath Misra on November 22nd, of course. Professor Baidyanath Misra, was the first founding secretary of Odisha Economic Association that was born basically in 1968. And then he became president in 1971. And he became the editor-in-chief of Odisha Economic Journal in the year 1978. So for one decade, Professor Vidyadhar Misra was the editor-in-chief, and then Professor Baidyanath Misra took charge of the journal in 1978. And then he did this job for 40 years, up to 2018. He was the editor-in-chief of the journal. And most importantly, he attended all the conferences except one or two he missed. From 1968 to 2018, he attended almost all the conferences. In fact, he was very much present in the Golden Jubilee annual conference of Odisha Economic Association, which was organized at Navakrishna Chaudhary Center for Development Studies, Bhubaneswar. So it is not actually limited. His job was not limited to only Odisha Economic Association. He was an institutional builder. He was a vice chancellor of OUAT, and he was the head of the department at Utkal University. And then he was the first chairperson. He was the chairperson of the first Finance Commission of Odisha. He was the founding director of Navakrishna Chaudhary Center for Development Studies, and so on. So he has a number of achievements, and he has published a number of books, published journal articles, and so on. So, and he was a fantastic teacher. With this brief introduction about Professor Baidyanath Misra, I would now request the President of Odisha Economic Association, Dr. Jugal Kishore Mahapatra, to have his initial remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Amarendra. First of all, let me welcome Dr. Kunal Sen and thank him profusely for having accepted our invitation to deliver this very important lecture for us. Dr. Baidyanath Misra perhaps was a friend, mentor, and guide to many members of the association. Most of us had very personal association with him. I personally knew him from 1986 onwards. He's a phenomenal personality and certainly one of the founders of the Odisha Economic Association. we couldn't have found a better person to deliver this lecture, and that's the reason why the deviation was made. The speaker was more important to us than the date, because so therefore we didn't want to lose this opportunity of having Dr. Sen to deliver this lecture. And thanks to Keshav, my distinguished predecessor, Dr. Keshav Das, for connecting us to Dr. Sen. I would now request first, I think, Basant Babu, who is here, to say a few words about his eminent father. And then I would request Dr. Keshav Das to please take this event forward. And I will come in at the end towards to make some concluding remarks. Thank you so much. Dr. Basant Misra, please.
Good afternoon, good evening. I don't know our guest speaker is from India or from abroad. I don't know what's the time he's in.
He's abroad, I think.
Oh, which
I'm
time
in
are you
Finland.
in? Yeah, so it's good afternoon maybe, right? Yeah, still good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining in and delivering this oration in my father's name. We are indeed very grateful to the Odisha Economic Association for this honor to my father. Thank you very much, and all the best. You can please continue. I don't want to waste your time.
I think,
Keshav Babu, you can take it forward.
yeah, and I think as both Amarendra and Jugal Babu mentioned that I think today is a very special day for us because the lecture is in the name of someone who has shaped lives, ideas, and economies for several years, several decades, in fact. And so it is in his name, Professor Baidyanath Misra. I think it's his name. I think it's a kind of household name, you can say. And you can't think of economic development issues, particularly concerning Odisha or developing economies. Or when you think of a great teacher, you think of a great institution builder. I think you just can't miss Professor Baidyanath Misra. And at the same time, we are like doubly happy, privileged to have Professor Kunal Sen. It's a huge privilege for us, and in fact, as you know, that he's an extremely busy person. He's a person in great demand all over the world. And so what I'll do is very briefly introduce him. But then before that, I also want to say a few things. I'm not that I know much about structural transformation and the issues we'll be dealing with, but because it is relating to India and because of his, that is Professor Sen's own work for several decades in the larger domain of both development economics and political economy, not just in India, but I think also in East Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa. So his huge experience with economies which were not necessarily privileged or which did not quite benefit from certain kinds of larger global policy changes. I mean, he's the expert, but then I thought maybe his work on informality, for instance, and his excellent, very well sort of quoted work on issues relating to sort of broad-basing gains of policy across board. So I sort of only wondered that maybe at some point we'll listen to him some issues relating to the question about informality as a dominant feature of the Indian economy, as it affects both the production and the labor processes. And also maybe, I don't know whether you would also touch upon a little bit on issues related to rural infrastructure, small producers. That's where I think much of the problem lies maybe. So one small thing also I would maybe expect him to make a comment maybe at the later stage of his presentation is to about this whole question about the poverty of database on Indian economy, on varieties of sectors, whether it's poverty data, whether it is data relating to census, data relating to micro, small, medium enterprises. So the data itself also has constrained our vision for a kind of maybe a more sustainable, inclusive structural transformation. So we are all sort of keen to listen to Professor Sen, who has about 3 decades of experience in both academic and applied development economics. He has written about 8 books, edited 5 volumes, and he has been extremely sort of like very widely quoted for his work for a long, long time. And as I did mention that he is a global recognized expert on political economy of growth and development, and his work sort of spans on issues relating to international finance, political economic determinants of inclusive growth, the dynamics of poverty, social exclusion, and also his very interesting work on female labor participation, and of course, as I did mention, his very useful work on informal sector. In fact, he is one of those few global economists who has really kept this pot boiling on informal sector, which many, I think, would not like to touch. And sort of some of his books are like India's Growth Episodes in 2016, The Process of Financial Liberalization in India, published in 1997, Economic Restructuring in East Asia and India. And so he's a co-editor of Deals and Development, The Political Dynamics of Growth Episodes, and The Politics of Inclusive Development. He has published widely. And he also, apart from being the director of the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economic Research at Helsinki in Finland, he has been the joint research director of the Effective States and Inclusive Development ESID Research Center. He has been a research fellow at the Institute for Labor Economics in Bonn, and he has been advising governments, and much before I think he became the director, he has been advising several bilateral and multilateral agencies, whether those include DFID, the ADB, the IDRC, and he also has received two very famous awards, the Sanjay Lal Prize in 2006 and the Dudley Sears Prize in 2003 for his publications. But before I sort of end the formal introduction to such an eminent and distinguished scholar, a professor and a policy thinker, because I know him a little bit personally. I think he's a fantastic human being to interact with, such a kind person. And it's an absolute pleasure whenever, wherever you meet, even for a moment. Professor Sen, we are looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Das, because we of course know each other for a long time actually, and it's a privilege to provide the 16th Professor Baidyanath Misra Endowment Lecture. Before I start my lecture, I want to say a few words about Professor Misra. I was privileged to know him for quite a long time. I got to know him in 1992. I should say exactly how I got to know him. That was the year of my marriage actually, and my father-in-law was very close to him. And so I remember when I first arrived in Bhubaneswar after my marriage, my father-in-law took me to meet Professor Baidyanath Misra at his house, at his home. And I remember sitting outside the balcony talking to him for a very long time, discussing many different issues around Odisha's economic development, but also many other issues. At that time itself, that was 1992, I was really amazed by his modesty, by his knowledge, by his insights, and the way he interacted with me, I will never forget. I was a very young person at that time, very young scholar actually. And then I used to meet him almost every year because I used to go to Bhubaneswar every year. And I met him in Navakrishna Chaudhary's Center for Development Studies several times there. And also at his home, because as I said, my father-in-law was very close to him. And the last time I met him, that was prior to his passing away, very unfortunate passing away. He was not in the best of health, but I remember when we suggested, can we meet him? He was very kind and he met us at his home. And so I have this wonderful memories of speaking to him on many different issues around Odisha's economic development, around other issues. And I've always valued the time I had with him. It was not that it would be an hour sitting and talking to him in his balcony or in the NCTS, but whatever it was always a privilege to speak to him. So in a way, I feel also very honored to give this lecture because of my long-term association with Professor Baidyanath Misra. And thank you to Mr. Mahapatra and think Amarnath Das for also, for putting this lecture together. So I'm going to speak about social transformation in India's, what I call India's torturous route to social transformation. But I also keep in mind what Professor Das mentioned, data issues, informality, rural infrastructure, and all actually come in a different way in this lecture. So let me begin. And so let me now move on to the next slide. And I hope you can see my slides. I think you can. So, so this, what I'm going to be speaking about, is something that economists have spent a lot of time thinking about for a very long time. I mean, goes back all the way to Simon Kuznets, Arthur Lewis, and others who are also worked on this kind of issues in the 1950s, 1960s. And what is very important to understand is that structural transformation, which is the movement of workers from agriculture to manufacturing and services, is a feature of modern economic growth. In fact, it's very difficult to imagine that you can have economic growth or modern economic growth without workers slowly over time moving away from agriculture to manufacturing and services. This has been the case for pretty much any middle income and high income country that you know of. And so, in particular, more recently, it's been what we see in the East Asian success stories, this process of structural transformation. And in fact, this kind of a view that that structural transformation is about workers moving from agriculture, manufacturing, and other services, is a kind of a unifying, powerful unifying vision of the process of economic development among both scholars and policymakers. And the question of transformation is still very alive. The reason is, that's why I will talk about India, is that in some parts of the developing world, we haven't really seen structural transformation. Which are the regions we haven't seen structural transformation? Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. East Asia has moved forward on this. Latin
Sorry,
America.
if you
Sorry.
could make it full screen, that would be good for us.
Yeah. So okay, there we go.
Thank you so much.
So basically, that's what we're going to try and talk about, and I'm going to draw from my recent book. It's a short book, actually. It's not a really. It's a short book published in the Cambridge University Press, the Economic Series. It's open access. Anybody can download it. So that's the good news. You can take a look at it without any problems. So I will also talk about data. Now, this data issue is important because one of the reasons why we haven't seen very much systematic work on structural transformation is because the data wasn't really there. What do we need to study structural transformation? You need sectoral employment and value-added data that is comparable across countries and over time. And in fact, that was not possible to do because we didn't have that data. So very recently, UNUIDA, the institution I'm a director of, along with the Groningen Growth and Development Center, who are very well known for producing economic data, including the Penn World tables and the input-output tables and so on. So we launched this new data set called the Economic Transformation Database, called which provides time series of employment and real nominal value added by 12 sectors in 51 countries for the period 1990 to 2018. Has 20 Asian countries, including India, of course, 9 Latin American, 4 Middle East and North African, and 18 sub-Saharan African countries at varying levels of economic development. It is the most complete database that exists on structural transformation, for especially for low and middle income countries. There have been previous data sets which are mostly for high income countries and some middle income countries. This particular data set has several low income and low middle income countries too. And I'm going to draw from this data because it's comparable data and it's very important here. So it's basically, this data is not easy to put together. It needs in-depth investigation of the availability and usability of statistical sources on a country-by-country basis. So a lot of archival work goes into it, and so it's not something that you can very quickly put together. That's just, again, why it has been difficult putting this data together previously till we put this data set together. So it's a new data set. It's not an update of time series and existing sectoral data set, completely new data set. And as I mentioned, the best coverage on low and middle income countries among all available data sets, 12 sectors in the ISIC Division 4 classification. I'll show the classifications to you, and has time series data that runs until 2018. After that, we could not get more recent data. And it starts 1990 because before 1990, the data that we were looking for were not really reliable. So it started 1990 to 2018. 12 sectors, agriculture, of course, mining, manufacturing, utilities, construction, trade services, transport services, business services, financial services, real estate, government services, and other services. And in this lecture I'm going to do, I'm going to bundle together business services and financial services together into one classification I call business services. That is the most productive for all services. And then outside of this business services, which is essentially sector number 8 and number 9, this other service sectors are trade services, transport services. Real estate is not so important in terms of structural transformation, government services and other services. I'm going to call that non-business services because they are much less productive than this business service sector. And then, of course, you have agriculture, of course, mining, and my manufacturing, utilities and construction. I will particularly focus on construction afterwards, and you see why I do that. But again, these classifications are standard in the literature. So using this classification, what I do in this book is I've put countries in different typologies in different stages. And this kind of approach of using typologies for economic development was very popular, very important in the early work that was there in this literature. Hasn't happened more recently. And so I try and think about what differentiates these countries. I do not use regions because that's not correct, because there may be two countries in two different regions who have similar properties on structural transformation. I don't look at specific countries in this book, which I'll talk about. I'll talk about India in this lecture. And so if you go by this typology, there are three categories. Structurally underdeveloped are countries which have agriculture still the largest sector in terms of share of employment, the most recent time period available, which is 2018. In this group, and it's interesting that you have many African countries, Burkina Faso, and then we have also Bangladesh here, Cambodia, Cameroon, Ethiopia, India is in this group. Kenya, Lao PDR, Malawi, Mozambique, Myanmar, Nepal, Nigeria, Pakistan, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, Vietnam, and Zambia. And these countries are Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. Then there are structurally developing countries where more workers are employed in the service sector than agriculture, with agriculture being still the second largest sector. I will not go through the list of countries here. The group I'm interested in is the structurally underdeveloped category in which India is. But this particular group spans all three continents, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And then there's a third group. The third group is structurally developed. And here we have countries where more workers are employed in manufacturing than agriculture. And as you can see from this, is mostly Latin America and Asia. And in fact, not even South Asia or East Asia. The only African country in this group is Mauritius. And Mauritius is quite an outlier in Africa, as one knows. So again, mostly Latin America, some North Africa, Tunisia is also there actually, and also East Asia. Okay, moving on. Now, I wanted to show you some patterns before I get to India, because I want to just show you what it looks for across the world. The first point is that is structural transformation level of income, per capita income, how strongly are they correlated? Well, of course, if you're structurally developed, you should be not surprised that you have high per capita income, because structural transformation leads to economic growth. But it is also quite interesting that in these categories, if you see now on the left-hand side of the slide, of my left-hand side, you can see that, yes, structurally underdeveloped countries are poorer than the structurally developing countries. Structurally developing countries are poorer than structurally developed countries on average. But you can see also huge variation in per capita income for the structurally underdeveloped category. In other words, there are countries in structurally underdeveloped category who are richer than you can see the almost as equal as the median in the structurally developing category. So per capita income is a good marker of structural transformation, but not really sufficient in itself. And that's an important point to make, because people are surprised to see India being in the structurally underdeveloped category, given that India has had rapid economic growth. But that's exactly what you find in the data. I just want to show you this one other figure that shows employment shares by stages of structural transformation. This is very like an overall bird's eye picture. You see that for those structurally underdeveloped countries, workers are mostly in agriculture. You can see the big number here. And very few are in business services and manufacturing. And there are some in non-business services, this dark blue here. If you look at structurally developing countries, much less number of workers in agriculture, much larger group of workers in manufacturing, and also some more workers in business services. And the final category, very few workers in agriculture, much more workers in manufacturing, and also now the share of business services increased quite a bit, even though there's still a lot of workers in non-business services. So that's really interesting, the drop in agriculture employment share as we move across stages of structural transformation, and particularly the increase in manufacturing employment share and business services employment share too, along with non-business services. And then if you look at it by these different categories, and this particular scatter plot of log GDP on the horizontal axis and agriculture employment share on the vertical axis, of course, as you go richer, there are less workers in agriculture. That's the fact. And you can see the scatter here for all the countries that we have. You can see the very clear negative slope here. But what is interesting is that when you start looking at it by country stages of transformation, you see a couple of interesting things. One is, if you look at the structurally underdeveloped category, this is the group where India is, it's really not a very, very negative slope. It's kind of flat. In other words, for this group, it's been very difficult as countries are growing richer in this group to take workers out of agriculture. That's quite striking. And that's a feature of underdevelopment in these countries. While if you are in structurally developing or structurally developed, yes, you see this negative slope again, but you see more variation. You see more variation. The scatter is not as precise as the one that we did when we had all the countries. So that's also interesting. Having said that, in these two categories, structurally developing and structurally developed, there's no question that workers are moving on to agriculture as countries are getting richer, while it's less obvious for the structurally underdeveloped category, and as I mentioned, where India is in this category. Okay, looking at the patterns again, what is interesting is, again, this is for the entire, set of countries we have. Of course, as workers, as time goes on, agriculture employment share falls. So this is now looking at it over time. We're looking at the panel here. And you can see that there is a big increase in non-business services here, the dark blue line. And interestingly, we don't see much of a movement to manufacturing, business services, other sectors, non-manufacturing industry, which has got construction in it. So we don't really see much of a movement there. But when we look at it by stage of structural transformation, and we look at structurally underdeveloped categories, we can see that first, the movement of workers out of agriculture is very, very slow, very slow. Second, we can see that in this group, we don't even see any increase in manufacturing at all, or in business services. Whatever has been increasing is non-business services, which, as I mentioned, is a very low productivity sector. If you look at structurally developing category, the increase in non-business services is obviously quite a lot, but manufacturing is quite important, not increasing so much, but fairly important. And so is business services, which is showing an increase in more recent years. And then finally, the structurally developed, well, they are in a situation where most of the workers are out of agriculture and most of the workers are non-business services. And they are now in a situation where industrialization is past its peak. So manufacturing employment shares are falling, which is what we sometimes call premature deindustrialization, or is just a feature of economic development, that over time, workers are now getting into services, even out of manufacturing. Okay, so that's the overall pattern. And it's just important to keep in mind that India is in this category, under the structural underdeveloped category. And in this overall pattern, we see essentially slow movement of workers out of agriculture, and most of the movement is into non-business services, and very little movement happening in manufacturing, business services, or non-manufacturing industry, which includes construction. We're going to see that in the case of India, there are some important differences from this overall pattern, and that's why it's interesting to think why is India somewhat different from the overall set of countries we're looking at. Okay, I also want to mention, because it's important to understand that, what is it that drives structural transformation? And there's been a lot of work on this, where in both early on by Arthur Lewis and Simon Kuznets and many others, but more recently also, mainstream economics has been very interested in this question. And generally, there are two kinds of arguments. One is supply-side theories, which talk about productivity differentials, and that productivity differences across sectors can explain why workers move out of agriculture. So if agriculture productivity is pretty high and outstripping productivity of the manufacturing, that leads to a fall in the relative demand for labor in agriculture, and agriculture starts shedding workers, and as workers move to manufacturing. So basically, if agriculture productivity growth is high, interestingly, employment shares in agriculture starts falling quite quickly. And that's an interesting point, that it's really agriculture productivity growth that drives, in this case, structural transformation. On the other side, demand side stories, essentially as countries go richer, and so the demand for different goods and services change. So when you're poor, most of your consumption is on agriculture or food. As you go richer, you start demanding clothing, restaurants, meals. You start going out for restaurants and so on. And so over time, demand for commodities or services shift away from agricultural goods towards both services outputs and services, and to manufacturing output, like I mentioned, garments. So that's an interesting point, and that we often call the Engel effects, coming from the demand side. So they're both these two theories, and I'm arguing in this book that I have recently, that both are important. And in fact, the earlier literature said both are important. The more recent mainstream economics literature tries to separate them out, and often I feel quite unsuccessfully, because both are interacting with each other to explain structural transformation. And so in a way, you cannot say it's just one set of theories or one set of factors that drive structural transformation. Usually in any country, it's both supply side factors like productivity growth, for example, agriculture, along with demand side factors, which is essentially increasing demand for manufacturing goods and services compared to agriculture. Okay, I also want to show a couple of other scatters. I want to make this. I want to show a scatter that what about inequality? So if workers are moving out of manufacturing to agriculture to manufacturing, does inequality fall or increase? Uh, what about workers moving into services? What happens there? And what is interesting is, and there's a reason for looking at this, because Simon Kuznets said that as we have such a transformation, inequality will increase because we're moving from agriculture, which is a relatively low inequality sector, though not always. In many countries, you have large land holdings too, to manufacturing and services. We'll see more inequality over time. In this set of countries, which, as I said, includes low and middle income countries, we don't really see an evidence of increase in inequality. If anything, there's a decrease in inequality. And you can see, like here in the second figure here, where I separate out the countries in different categories. If anything, structurally developing countries here are showing decreasing inequality. Underdeveloped show also some decrease in inequality. The developed country also somewhat less strong, show a decrease in inequality for manufacturing. That's very interesting. So if manufacturing employment shares increase, it seems that case that three groups of countries, inequality is decreasing. And I have some work on this video to explain why that might be the case. Services, less clear. And that's because services has this high productivity business services and low productivity non-business services. So it's like, so you imagine workers moving both into becoming street vendors and also workers working in the financial sector. So there, it's not obvious that inequality will actually decrease. In fact, it should probably increase. And we find some evidence of that for the structurally developing countries, where inequality actually is increasing as more and more employment happening in service sector. On the other groups, it's not so obvious what the relationship is. It's pretty flat, the scatters. So that's interesting. Poverty, of course, it's obvious that poverty will fall. Why? The very nature of getting workers out of agriculture into manufacturing services almost surely will lead to poverty declining. And you can see that very negative relationship between structural transformation in manufacturing and poverty, structural transformation services and poverty, very clear across the set of countries. And even if you look at by the different stages of structural transformation, it's not so obvious for every category, but you see, for example, for structurally underdeveloped and for developing countries, this black bar and the orange broken line, the black broken line, the orange broken line, you can see that poverty is falling. Less clear for structurally developed, but that's because the poverty is already quite low there. And same thing with services employment share. So this is interesting because structural transformation, we of course know it's important for economic growth, but it may also have these other benefits, that it leads to inequality decreasing in for certain countries, and possibly also poverty falling. And that's something we can come back to in the discussion. Okay, India. All right, so let's think about India now. So I'm going to look at India using the same database, and I'm going to try to show you the things in India what we see in India validates what we already saw in the overall pattern that we saw for structurally underdeveloped countries, but there are things which are quite different also. And that's something I don't think scholars have spent a lot of time discussing. So first thing is, I'm going to now show you several figures. So I will look at aggregate employment share in 1990 when we have the data starting, the data starts, and then 2015 to 18 is the most recent years. And I'm just plotting now log GDP per capita on the horizontal axis and agriculture employment share on the vertical axis. And you can see that in terms of where India's placed, in India's this red thing I put here also, if it's where it's placed compared to its level of per capita income, it's pretty much on the regression line. So not that far away in the regression line. So that's quite interesting. There are countries which obviously have less agriculture employment shares for a given level of income, but India's on the regression line. So that seems to be the case with agriculture employment share. Manufacturing employment share, it's interesting because 1991 we had these big reforms, where we had major reforms in manufacturing, industrial policy was dismantled, and also major reforms on other trade policy reforms and so on. And if you look at manufacturing, one initial hypothesis would have been that manufacturing employment shares have really increased over this period because we have several reforms in industrial policy and trade policy. But actually, on the regression line, where we had log GDP per capita, we'll keep that as my for most of the scatters. India was doing better than the regression line in 1990. It's now close to the regression line in 2015-18. So in structural manufacturing, we don't seem to see evidence that India's done better than it should have if you use per capita income as your control, so to speak, as what you might expect given R to per capita income. Of course, the slope here is positive here, as you expect. Countries grow richer, more workers in manufacturing. But India, actually, if anything, seems to be slipped a little bit below over this period in terms of being now close to the regression line, which wasn't the case in 1990. And that's an interesting observation that's worth thinking about. What about services? Now, this is interesting. Another hypothesis would have been, well, India's done fantastically well in IT. Look at the IT companies we have globally now, which are Indian. And that would have been my initial hypothesis also. But when you look at the business services, again, for the most recent period that we have, India's actually not even performed at what it should be. It's below the regression line. So that's interesting. So in business services, which seems to be an area where India should have done well, given its history in IT exports, it hasn't done all that well compared to where it should be, given its per capita level of per capita income. And the non-business services, certainly much below the regression line. So it seems that India, if you just sort of summarize this few graphs that I presented, agriculture employment, India is kind of at par. Manufacturing is slipped a little bit towards where it now on the regression line. And in services, whether business services, non-business services, actually below the regression line. So it's below what it should be based on income. So then that question then means, the question you have to ask is then what exactly is going on here? If services are not providing the employment, manufacturers not really providing the employment, workers are moving out to agriculture very slowly, but they are. What else is happening? Well, it's construction. So India here in 1990, it was still above the regression line in construction employment share. But look where India is now. India's employment and construction share is far higher than any other developing country. Far higher. If you look at where it is, 50%, it's figuring after that we have countries here, a few bunch of countries, China's here and so on. Far higher than any other comparable country. So India's, if anything, the structural transformation in India has been where workers move to construction, not to manufacturing, not to business services, not to non-business services. And that makes India an outlier. Now, you might say, well, okay, fine. Construction, it's another source of employment. As long as workers are getting higher income in construction compared to agriculture, why should we be worried? Well, I'll show you that there are reasons to be worried. And in fact, you might as well already understand why it's worrying. The construction in India is not a very high productivity sector. And in fact, as Professor Das mentioned to me, informality is widespread in construction. So all that's happening is workers in agriculture, poorly paid workers in agriculture, mostly agriculture wage laborers are moving into cities or moving into construction. Some construction happens also in rural areas, into slightly better paid, but not much better paid jobs in construction. That is not really structural transformation, right? And that, again, is very obvious here. And this is the line plots of all the different sectors. So agriculture is this line here, that's the red line here. And then we have non-business services, the orange line here. And then look at construction. Construction, from a point where it was almost as equal to agriculture employment, suddenly shoots up to, in fact, overtake manufacturing. So in other words, in India, there are more workers in construction than manufacturing. And this increase has happened quite rapidly in the 2000s. So that's really, really surprising and quite puzzling. Why is it? And if you look at this line, if you now do an exponential trend of this line, construction is going to overtake non-business services at some point. So the agriculture employment shares are going to fall. We know that happens as you grow richer, but that movement is happening into construction, the green line. So that's really, really surprising. And you might say, well, and I just I'm going to show a few more scatters and then come back to the question, what's really going on? So you might say, well, but what about construction productivity? How is it? Well, That's the problem. India's construction productivity, this is construction productivity over manufacturing productivity. So looking relative productivity here, you can see India's construction productivity compared to manufacturing is significantly below the regression line. So it's not even the case that workers are moving from one low productive sector to a fairly okay productivity sector. And productivity is linked to wages. Higher productivity means higher wages. So we see again a problem here that is quite surprising. And the other stat I want to show is that not only have we had structural transformation that is quite strange in India, if you call it if you can even call it structural transformation, but at least we have workers moving on agriculture, in that sense, structural transformation. We also see high inequality happening as over time. Look at 1990. So I'm using the net Gini here. In my manufacturing shares on the horizontal axis, the net Gini, net income Gini is on the vertical axis. Over time, steadily as there's been structural transformation, here I'm using manufacturing share, inequality is also increased. That is not what we saw in the overall patterns for structurally underdeveloped countries, or even for all countries. So even there's something else going on. So I want to then like you might say, okay, so that's interesting, but what about how is India doing the rest of the developing the countries who are in such an underdeveloped category? Is India the same or different? And that was my point. That in India, and I'm sorry you can't see all that well, so I put all these such underdeveloped countries here, mostly African countries. The thing that I just want to show to you is that you can see it just about, I'm sorry, this could have been made bigger. The green line is construction here. And in fact, the only country where you see construction increasing in this way among all these countries, if you look at all these countries, it's India. No other country in this group have we seen construction employment share increase in this way. That is really, really surprising. So that's just to make the point. What we're seeing in India is different from what we see for other structurally underdeveloped countries. And in fact, if I put all the countries in this figure, it'll even be more obvious. But I don't want to do that because then there'll be 51 countries in this figure. So that's really interesting. So question, okay. So on manufacturing, I'm not going to say anything much more than what's already been mentioned in the literature. I've done a lot of work on this. Of course, there are many things why manufacturing has not increased. Why haven't we seen job creating growth in manufacturing, as we see in East Asia, China? There are lots of different reasons. The trade regime is still biased towards capital-intensive manufacturing. And so the problem is because we cut tariffs on capital goods so much, now capital is cheap compared to labor. And that's why firms are substituting towards capital-intensive manufacturing. And I have a paper in EPW that shows that. So that's one reason. The second reason is, there's been some debate about this, but I do think the margin employment protection legislation has also led to a less of an incentive of firms to essentially hire workers. Of course, they're mostly now moving into contract labor, not even moving out of employment. I mean, not moving into capital in this case. So not to hire workers in permanent contracts, move firms to more capital-intensive modes of production, then warranted by existing cost of labor related to capital. There's a lot of work on this, and I don't want to get too much into this now. Thirdly, informal manufacturing, major infrastructural bottlenecks, access to electricity, other impediments to entrepreneurial growth, such as the high cost of formalization, has also played a part. And of course, all of them important. I don't necessarily think that one factor is the most important. I think it's a mistake to single out one factor. All have got this problem of jobless growth in manufacturing. These are long-term problems and are likely to persist unless they're policy reforms at the national level, which are difficult to do politically. So this, again, there's a lot of work on this, and I'm just summarizing literature here. But I want to know about construction now. So again, backing into productivity, because that's really a good measure of what people earn, living standards, right? So again, back to productivity. And I'm not looking at labor productivity, real labor productivity, because that is there in the data set, real value added over number of workers. And what is interesting here is here's agricultural productivity, the blue line, really a little bit of an increase over time. But look at construction productivity here, this line here. It seems that right now, construction productivity is almost the same as agricultural productivity. Absolutely staggering, really. Which means that workers, if they move to construction, if you just use this as a metric of wages, real wages, effectively they're not going to earn much more than what they were earning in agriculture. And Indian agriculture is, as we know, not very productive. So this is quite remarkable that productivity in construction is now pretty much as equal as agriculture. And of course, business services are the most productive of all the sectors. Of course, that's where the best jobs are. And manufacturing also, but manufacturing is not as productive as business services. And then of course you have non-business services, which is also not as productive as manufacturing and agriculture. But what is startling about this figure is construction. And given what we see in India, are mostly this kind of picture that we see put up here. Construction workers who are essentially very poorly paid and extremely informal. Almost all these workers are informal, as one can easily understand. So here then, so what is going on here? So again, going back to the theory of structural transformation, and this is just my own thoughts about this, which I need to also work on more, because this is just a preliminary set of thoughts on this. On the supply side, what has happened is we haven't had agricultural productivity growth being as strong as it is in China and other East Asian countries. So there are not as many workers being released to the non-agriculture sector. And where they have moved, it's into the low productivity construction sector. Partly it's easy to find employment in the sector with cities increasing in size. So it's easy to find. So you think about a worker who wants to get out of agricultural jobs, a wage laborer, an agricultural wage laborer, goes to the city, easy to find a job on the construction side, because as we know, they're mostly unskilled work there. On the demand side, because there's very limited demand for jobs in manufacturing and business services for the reasons I outlined, so there are really no jobs in manufacturing and business services in the cities. On the other hand, also we've had this lot of construction work going on in rural areas, PMGSY. That also might explain construction employment being so high in India. Along with that, a property boom driven by the middle class that led to a construction boom and a large mass of informal workers moving from construction side to construction side. The scholar I find the most useful on understand this phenomena is not an economist, he's an anthropologist, Jan Bremen. I just mentioned one book here that is on footloose labor, but there are many other, he's got a whole body of great, wonderful work in this. But really, it's about a situation where we have a bunch of workers, very poorly paid, highly informalized, just moving from site to site to site. As Bremen describes, one day they're in one part of the city looking for work, another day they're in another part of the city looking for work, or in a different city sometimes in the next day. And they usually don't have their families with them. The families are still in the villages. So these are workers who are, as Bremen says, footloose labor. Okay, so I just want to end now. So essentially, India remains structurally underdeveloped country. Even within this group, it has followed a typical path where workers have moved out of agriculture, has moved to mostly low productivity construction and non-business services, not to manufacturing and not to business services. Construction has mopped up the surplus labor of agriculture. In such a path, the structural transformation is unlikely to lead to sustained inclusive growth. The whole point of structural transformation is workers moving from low productivity to high productivity sectors. That is not happening here. And of course, there's the policy message here, and I think this needs more thought and more discussion, is to try to unlock the potential of manufacturing and business services to create productive jobs. But having said that, the challenge here is enormous for India. Because if the challenge is that how can we get workers not to work in construction, but in more productive sectors, it's not obvious how this transformation can happen even within a decade. Maybe it might take decades. So sorry, I'm ending on a slightly pessimistic note, but it's something that I think I do feel strongly about. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm very happy to take questions. Just on the question of data, so that's what Keshav, you asked me. The data we are here, of course, we have put it together, and it's quite reliable. But the data that we also need on employment in different kinds of employment comes from the employment survey, what we call EUS from the NSS, that is not available for recent years. The data on poverty also comes from the consumer expenditure survey from the NSS, that is not available in recent years. So we are also stuck by the fact that we not even have data to look at more detailed accounts of what's happening in the sectors. For example, I would love to put up some data on wages in different sectors, for which I need the employment survey, and we do not have access. We do not have a recent employment survey, so that's a problem. Informality. Well, what's going on here is very straightforward, really, and we have a book on this called The Job Ladder. We have workers in the lower tier of the informal labor market who are wage laborers, agricultural wage laborers, mostly from particular social groups, as we also know, Dalits, for example. And what's happening is that they're moving, when they move from agriculture, they're moving to another sector, highly informalized, construction. Construction in India is not a formalized sector. In many other developing countries, construction is formal because you have highly capital intensive ways of producing of buildings and so or construction and so on. So what we have is a situation where workers move from one informal job type of job to another informal type of job. And maybe they have a slightly better income when they move to construction, maybe not. We don't. That is not so obvious. But it's not a situation which leads to transformation in any meaningful sense of the word. Okay, let me stop here. And I just stop sharing so that we can then have a discussion. Is that okay if I stop sharing now?
Yeah, yeah. So maybe we take some questions and comments, whatever, from this very extremely interesting presentation that Professor Kunal made. So questions, comments, whatever, please.
Yes, I think Suman has raised hand first, and then Professor Prabhakar sir.
Thank you. Greetings to everyone. Good evening to all the participants who are joining from India, and in particular, greetings to Professor Sen for a very illuminating and a very scholarly lecture. It has, I mean, I think the lecture has been very comprehensive in uh, covering various aspects and dimensions of structural transformation and the various economic and socio-economic aspects of it. Professor Sen, I just want to ask two questions of you. One is, have you had a chance to look at the trends of structural transformation and the availability or intensity of social protection that comes with structural transformation? That's one thing. Second is, I think, although you ended on a note that policymakers should be looking at unlocking the potential in manufacturing and services both, it's also a fact that the employment elasticity of manufacturing GDP is coming down, and in any way, the gold standard to me, as I saw from your presentation, is a scenario where there's a lot of employment moving from agriculture to services. So, would you suggest that India should give up a policy obsession of moving workforce from the agriculture into the manufacturing and instead take them straight from agriculture to services? Two questions, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Should we take two couple of
maybe.
questions, maybe
Yeah,
three,
yeah.
and
Yeah, Professor Prabhakar Sahu, maybe, please. You have to unmute Professor Sahu.
Sorry. Very good evening, Professor Sen. Excellent lecture. Actually, I really enjoyed it. I hope you remember I'm Prabhakar here from IIT. Okay, couple of points. The first thing is the bigger picture is very clear. When it comes to India, what happened is it's basically we didn't follow the linear stage growth theories, moving step by step from agriculture to manufacturing to services. That is where actually both the supply side and demand side factors, whether it is productivity differentials across the sectors, which didn't work and it's not working. From your presentation, what it is clear that okay, productivity is very high in business services, but when it comes to the employment share, it has not happened. The productivity in construction it is going down, but still lot of kind of labor force moving from agriculture to the construction sector, low productivity. Now, coming to the construction sector, I wanted to point out one small thing. It is starting from 2007 onwards, in terms of valuation, investment, and everything, the construction sector, in terms of value added also, it's not doing great. In fact, the investment in the construction sector, the majority in the total investment, it has gone down almost by 20%. But then why is it that it is observing so much of employment or people moving away from agriculture to construction when it is not doing it? That's one point. The second point you spoke about the inequality, maybe it is right when you look at 30 years data starting from 90s, I understand right. On an average at macro level it is fine, but there are reports, world income inequality report and all that, they're bringing out that inequality has been going up. If you just look at the share of top, bottom 10%, bottom 50%, and all that. So inequality, of course, I don't know what exact measurement of inequality you have taken, but then inequality has been going down. And the main reason is over a period of time, it's basically innovation and capital intensive led growth, and it is not a labor phenomena anymore. It's capital phenomena. So the inequality is going up. Now, my point is, what is it that we can do? Because the kind of suggestions you are giving, we all know that. Right now, I am part of the government working at NITI as senior advisor. I keep thinking about it, and Anshuman made a point that okay, maybe right now we are doing well in business services or services-led growth. So why not actually move away labor force from agriculture culture to services? But I don't think that is the best way. In fact, the mistake we made after 90s is, before 90s, we are kind of very predominantly agricultural-led growth or agricultural-intensive growth. And after reforms, because we had state-supported high-skilled labor force, we moved from agriculture to services without significant improvement in manufacturing. That is where we missed the bus. So what we need to do, given the world is aging, India is a young country with average age of 29% or 29 years, we need to focus on labor-intensive manufacturing when most of the manufacturing giants, including China, they are giving away space in labor-intensive manufacturing. And all these small countries, Vietnam, Philippines, and all that, they don't have the market or endowments to capture that space. So we need to focus on. Now, my simple point is, you are giving us some broad hints, infrastructure, ease of doing business, and all that to unlock the potential of manufacturing. But anything specific we can do for a labor intensive or low value added labor intensive manufacturing, specific inputs that I can take forward from you and reach out to the top. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe Professor Barendra Goi, but then may I make a request, special request that please be absolutely brief. There are many people
I'm
who wish
sorry
to
I've
ask.
taken more time. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, I think it's a general point that I mean. Yeah, please. Yes, Professor Goi, please. Yeah.
Good evening. Very excellent presentation about what has happened. I don't have any question. I have some observations. Our structural reforms were mostly confined to financial sector so far. So financial sector transformation, whatever has happened, that was also a compulsion for the Indian economy. There was no way out but to go for financial sector reform. Otherwise, we are defaulting on the international payments. Now, the second generation reform that is now required, that is in the real sector. For real sector reform, what is necessary is there should be a consensus among the state governments, because most of the real sector, agriculture, other things, they are with them. That is one thing. Second thing, government tried to have some say real sector reform in agriculture. There was vehement opposition, at least from Punjab. That was good for the farmers, but they could not be able to pursue it. They have to withdraw it. And transfer of laborers from agriculture to services is mainly because in both the sectors the productivity is less. So agricultural laborers can be utilized only in construction sector where the productivity is less. But productivity where the higher level of productivity is required, like manufacturing and services, they are found not very useful. That's why they are not in a position to move to manufacturing and services sector. This is what actually I would like to conclude. I don't want to take more time.
Yeah.
This is what actually my observation is.
So, Professor Sen, you take these three now and come back later, or you want to take more questions?
No, let's take the three actually, because they are also related questions, so it helps me to also answer. So I want to take a set of questions around, the question of labor into manufacturing, employment elasticity, real sector reforms and together, because one has to be careful of employment elasticity, because construction actually has very high employment elasticity. Why? Because as Professor Sao, good to see you actually in this lecture. Look forward to seeing you again in IEG at some point soon. Because value added is very low in construction. It's not a high productivity sector, right? We already saw the chart, the figure on that. And there's a lot of employment. So employment elasticity, if you use that metric, you say, my God, construction is the future for India. But then what are we talking about? Workers employed in really very poorly paid jobs, and as I mentioned, also extremely precarious livelihoods, as has been described by Jan Preben, the scholar. Is that what we want for our workers in India? Not absolutely not, right? So employment elasticity is important when we have, along with that, growth in that sector. If manufacturing was growing quite rapidly and employment elasticity was also high, that's a perfect scenario. But we don't have that. So we have manufacturing growth not all that strong, but also employment elasticity actually falling over time, as was mentioned with the first question of questions. So the point really is that, and I think that goes to what Professor Sahu, you were saying, that ultimately we have to think about getting the growth sectors, the ones that are going to provide good jobs, not even growth, the better jobs that we want, manufacturing and business services. Not so much non-business services. Non-business services is not very productive, because what are they? These are street vendors. These are those who are work on our informal sector. So I would not say non-business services is the sector we want to really try to encourage, right? That might happen later on as people start spending more money on going out for meals and all that. We already saw that in developed countries, but not at the beginning, because India is in that beginning stage. You see, that is what I find remarkable. India is at the beginning of the process of structural transformation, in spite of 50 years or 60 years of economic development. That is surprising. India is in the same category as Burkina Faso, in the same category as Malawi, same category as Ethiopia. How remarkable is that, right? So that is, I just want to make this very clear that we are talking about a major challenge here, right? So the way to think about it is that manufacturing, and I agree with Professor Sahu, there are many ways to think about increasing employment elasticity without necessarily just purely focusing on that as the only objective, because then we have a construction problem that we have in construction, right? And I think the way to do that is to try. So, for example, and Professor Das works on value chains, regional and global value chains. India has not really done well on global value chain or regional value chains. Regional value chains, we do not have yet a functioning free trade area in South Asia. I was in Africa a few weeks back, in the United Nations Economic Commission Africa. They have now an African free trade area coming along called FTA, and that can make a big difference in Africa, for African countries. What has India got at this point? We do not have a functioning regional FTA, and we are not even members of the more dynamic FTAs that are there, like ASEAN and so on, right? And then we talk about also the value chain situation, and there are others here who are more knowledgeable about this than I am, Professor Das in particular, is that that we haven't got into the value chains that are the dynamic value chains, electronics, garments, and so on. So those are things which I think the current policies are around Make in India may have some promise. I'm not completely convinced. And also this trying to protect some of the domestic sector now with the production linked incentive scheme may have some promise. We don't know yet how that will work. So it's still open question whether those kind of schemes will work. But there is a big challenge here that for India, manufacturing is going to be important and leverage to manufacturing. And as Professor Sahu mentioned, China's now moving up. They have now passed the Lewisian turning point. Their wages are increasing. So they are now vacating many of the labor-intensive commodity, the sectors. So India can enter those sectors. Why should it be Lao PDR? Why should it be Cambodia? Why should it be other countries that are doing so well in Southeast Asia? So that's a big problem around labor-intensive manufacturing. And as I said, there are many reasons why that has not succeeded in India. The other issue of business services, can that be a source of a lot of productive jobs? Possibly, possibly. Right now, it's not so much, but it could be. Because why is that the case? Because we are seeing the shift that is happening where tradable services jobs are becoming more and more common. Services jobs are not seen as tradable jobs before, right? Services, the classic non-tradable sector. But now we see a lot of tradable jobs. And Richard Baldwin, who I really respect his work, Richard Baldwin says services is a new manufacturing because tradable services has the same properties as manufacturing: spillover effects, externalities, scale economies, all of the things that we want manufacturing to also do. So tradable services in India, which is business services in most part, can be a source of jobs in India, good jobs in India. And I think that's an area where maybe that's India's strength because India has now a large number of those who've been college educated, can speak English, and so on and so forth. So maybe that's a potential here. Right now, it's still not the case that business services are delivering the good jobs in India. So just to sort of say that, I mean, the main challenge is to think about why is employment elasticity in manufacturing not so high? Why is employment elasticity in business services not high? And in the areas where it is high, construction and non-business services, we should not see those as models for economic for social transformation, because that has not been the case in any other country in the past. And particularly construction, there is a bigger issue here that are we really seeing a situation of aborted structural transformation? A Lewisian trap is what I think I like to put it like that, a Lewis type trap, where the Lewis argument was that workers can move from traditional sectors like agriculture to modern sectors like manufacturing. But the Lewisian trap in India is that we're moving from one kind of traditional sector, agriculture, to another kind of traditional sector, construction. And that's a trap. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. On social protection, the point here is that unless you create productive jobs, it's very difficult to deliver social protection, right? Because they have to be financed. So unless you have productive jobs, which are high income jobs, then there's a way to finance large scale social protection. Of course, you can do Manrega. That's very useful. That's employment of large result. Those things are possible. But the kind of social protection that we've seen in East Asia, in Latin America, of course, in the advanced countries, that's difficult without genuine social transformation leading to high productivity and high paying jobs. So I think there is a limit to what we can do if we cannot create those kind of jobs, maybe mostly the formal sectors. And I do think that's going to be a challenge for India going forward to deliver the kind of social protection we've seen in Latin America, which has been in Latin America, you actually have access to social protection even if you're not in the formal sector, because there's enough of where the state can support you in that case. In India, it's very, very difficult to do that. So I think there is a genuine problem here with social protection, essentially where we cannot move to more universal social protection and essentially move away from the Manrega type, which is very important, of course, but it is not going to be transformative compared to what we see in Latin America. So let me stop there.
So what I'll do, there are some over 3-4 questions on the chat box,
Can
and
I
then
take 10 seconds?
Okay.
Cover career. Sorry.
Yeah, please. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, a little brief,
I
maybe.
just want to make a small request to Professor Sen. When it comes to like manufacturing, particularly unlocking labor-intensive manufacturing, if we can get inputs, to carry out some studies and we get some specific inputs, particularly the low-hanging fruit, without much political capital that can be carried out easily, I would be very grateful. Actually, I'm looking at this issues quite very seriously. So I'd be very happy because what I see is more or less both supply side and demand side factors actually fail, our structural transformation. We are still at the kind of, after 50 years at the bottom. So I would be looking forward to receive your input. Anything specific that can be implemented much more easily, like, okay, so we know the structural reforms in the medium term and long term, these are all there. But specific input. Thank you so much. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks. Great lecture. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are just 3-4 questions in the chat box, which I quickly had. One by Janti Behera asking for reasons for rise in construction employment. There is another from Kaigolyapati Misra asking about if you could say something about the human side of structural transformation. And there is one by Mousumi Das asking about what kind of source that you might have used for your work. And there is one from Aparimita Misra talking about as men are moving out of agricultural sector, So she's essentially asking about, can you please explain the structural transformation of both men and women from your data? So these are four questions in the chat box. But then, Amarendra, please.
Should I ask now or after Professor Sen replies to the questions?
Maybe you can ask. I don't know if Professor Sen can take your question also. So
Okay.
maybe you ask. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know whether it's a question. I felt like I was trying to understand actually why the manufacturing sector is not taking off in India. So, say in other countries, agriculture created surplus. I'm again using probably Lewis theory again, that agriculture generates a lot of surplus that gets invested in industry and manufacturing grows, and then labor also are transferred from agriculture to industry. But in case of India, we have so many people, and that's how agriculture doesn't generate any surplus. Okay? And so then there is nothing to invest in manufacturing sector. Now, how will the manufacturing sector take off? Either through the government investment, or like some entrepreneurs are who have minimum surplus, or through financial sector development. Now you try to develop the industry. Now, in that case, actually, I have been thinking that, say, in case of, so you need actually entrepreneurial community who have the willingness to borrow from banks and do the investment. Now, in case of India, but I feel that the size of the middle class is quite low, and if you do not have a family's income support, then you are not going to take the risk actually and get into the manufacturing sector. So, like you have already shown that the per capita income of India is quite low, and so that doesn't also help the people to take the risk and get into the manufacturing sector. But now, as Dr. Barendra Bhoi was pointing out, that now in India we have a financial sector development. Now, will that help us to actually get into the manufacturing sector? And also, the size of the middle class has grown, and we are doing this campaign of Make in India and Startup India and all that. So, will it give a push to the manufacturing sector? So, I'll start here.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Professor San, please.
Let me answer the last Amarnath asked the question because that's a really interesting question. So the point here is that the middle class, as you mentioned, of course, generates demand for goods and services. Of course, that's obvious, and also construction, property, right? I mean, that's one part of the reason why I've seen the construction sector expanding. So much of construction going on for the middle class is demand for housing, right? But the one thing that's, and this is where I have a clear view on this, where sometimes, which sometimes people may not agree with me. Ultimately, the middle class generates demand, but we know ultimately the demand that it drives economic development in Southern transformation has to be from outside, right? And it has to be export led for the first stages of economic development. Very difficult to generate demand internally without also generating demand externally, right? And India's not done too well in exports. And this is exactly the value discussion, the global value chain we're having, right? India's not done very well in exports, except IT exports. That's the only thing where India's done well. Not in manufacturing exports, not in capital intensive manufacturing, nor in labor intensive manufacturing. So the middle class can provide a buffer and generate demand, but at the end of the day, it is a mistake to think that will lead to economic transformation because that has not been the case elsewhere. Yeah, India is a large country, so much a larger middle class. So in that sense, a bigger market, home market. But and the home market is used for the beginning of a stage. You can, because there's enough demand in the country itself. At the end of the day, there has to be external demand also, right? The Koreas, the Taiwan, the Singapores, the Chinas, all of them, there was a period of home demand coming from in South Korea, for example, which is a large market too. But ultimately, it came from outside too. So that's the concern that why has not India done very well in the export, in the demand generated from outside, right? And that has been historically been the case, not just recently. And the other point here is that that I think the issues around financial development is important, but the one big issue which we haven't discussed yet in manufacturing, and I've done some work on this as on a couple of EPW papers, that there is a missing middle problem. So you have the small little informal enterprises, household enterprises, who are all like maybe household, maybe 5 people in the household, 6 people, maximum 8 or 9. And then you look at the size distribution of companies from 10 workers onwards to pretty much 100 workers, and it's all missing. There's no firms in that category. And then you get this 500 plus or large corporations, corporate firms. Like India has got very large corporate firms, right? So that is something that's different in India from, I would say, the East Asian story. In East Asia, Vietnam is a very good example, actually. There was a lot of employment generated by these middle-sized firms in manufacturing. So why is that the case? Because even with financial development, many of these firms struggle to get access to finance, right? If you look at the World Bank's enterprise surveys, access to finance comes up number one, number two for enterprises in India at the smallest of the distribution. If you're a Tata or a Birla, you're not going to have a problem accessing finance, right? But if you're a small little, just started a startup, you moved away from maybe informal sector to the formal sector as a manufacturing company, but you need to now expand the size of operations. So in that sector, in that group of firms, it's very difficult getting finance. So financial reforms, of course, were needed, and as was mentioned in the earlier question, but it has not yet allowed for the kind of finance that firms, enterprises need, right? And the missing middle problem is one reason why we haven't seen employment-intensive manufacturing growth. And of course, there's other reasons. Electricity is another issue that comes up, and so on and so forth. There are many other skilled workers, as mentioned also in the discussion. Skilled workers, all of these are also important. But that missing middle problem has to be sorted out. Because if it's not sorted out, then we should not expect employment intensity manufacturing to increase. Because these large corporations will generate thousands of jobs, right? So I think that's what the big issue here right now in India is, the missing middle problem in manufacturing. And that might explain why manufacturing has not been able to create enough jobs. Now, on the other issue, other questions, construction, why is construction, generating jobs? As I said, the way I see this, and I have not yet put it together in an analytical framework, I see this as a problem where what Arthur Lewis talked about, that construction is your residual sector for employment. You want to get out of agriculture because it's very difficult work, working in the farm and so on, and then you end up as a construction worker in the city. Where else would you go, right? So it's a residual sector. So if people are moving to construction, so in the literature of structural transformation, people say that there is growth enhancing structural transformation, and there is growth limiting or growth constraining structural transformation. Danny Roderick has some very nice work on this with Margaret Macmillan. So in India, it's not growth enhancing structural transformation. If you do even say this movement to construction is structural transformation, which I'm not even sure one should say that, right? So construction is your residual sector. Till as long there is not enough jobs in manufacturing and business services. As long as that's not there, the workers from rural areas are going to end up as construction work, because also of the fact they don't need much skills. Now, the other way to think about this is skilling the workers. Education, of course, has increased among primary education, increased quite a bit in rural areas, but skills are often at a disadvantage. So there is an argument also of skilling these workers so they can then be employable in the manufacturing sector or in the business service sector, and rather than end up in a sector like construction where there's hardly any need for any kind of skills, right? So I think that's one important question. The human development issue that was asked, I think that, what I showed earlier was poverty does seem to fall with structural transformation. I did not have data on Indian poverty in India because of the data issues that Professor Das mentioned. The income inequality measure we put together in WIDER, we've now constructed a comparable data set on inequality also. It's called the WIID, and you can take a look at it. But it's on. I do think that poverty may have fallen in this process, but not as much as you normally expect. The figures I showed in other countries, poverty fell quite sharply. Like think about China. In India, I'll be surprised if we did have reliable data on poverty, which we don't. Then I'd be surprised if poverty fell as sharply in India when there was movement of workers out of agriculture. So even that's a hypothesis we can test when we have better data. Now on the data issue, so we used labor force surveys, we used census data. So the work that we have done on this is essentially using data sets which provide sectoral employment and value-added data. So census data, economic census, population census, labor force service, some national income accounts, putting all together, And the people who did this, I didn't do this work myself. I mean, putting the data together. But the people who did this work, they have been doing this for a long time for other countries. They're very, very careful about how they do it, which is why I feel that we had some questions about the Indian data actually. We were not completely sure about some of the issues, some of the data. But we feel now that what you have is as reliable as possible, with the caveats that data is a problem in India right now. Good economic data, right? On gender, it's a very important question. ETD does not have it yet by gender, and I'll tell you why not. So and that's very important to understand. So, essentially, if you look at data by gender, manufacturing, we do have male and female employment for the unit database. Agriculture, we can also do that. In services, there's a big problem on gender disaggregated data. Until we have that, and services are not only services of aggregate, but services by the different sectors that I showed, that we do not have gender disaggregated data. And I think it's a big, big weakness that that data producing agencies like the World Bank, ILO, and others need to do something about. Why are we missing gender disaggregated data for the service sector, given that it's now becoming the largest employing sector across all countries? Very big, very, very disappointing. If you did only manufacturing only, yes. Agriculture only, yes. We can do that. But of course, we want to create a data set that covers all the different sectors. But maybe it's something, the next thing to do, once we get this kind of data set, maybe from the ILO, maybe from the World Bank, we don't know. But that's a very important, it's a big gap, I would argue. So let me stop I think I got the questions from the
Yeah.
chat. I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Professor Deepak Misra, please.
Yeah, thank you. As always, Professor Sen, it was a pleasure to hear you. I just wanted to bring in, I mean, it was actually based on the last observation that you made about skills. Now, I wanted to bring back the question of agrarian transformation to this discussion, because the reason that we have got so many people who are leaving, so many workers who are leaving agriculture without much education and skill could be the link to the failure of agricultural incomes to take off in the previous decades. So when we are talking about the future, do you think that there is still the room for thinking about the kind of agricultural growth we are going to have, or the characteristics of the growth that you are going to have in agriculture from the perspective of structural change when we are looking at India? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very complex, difficult question to answer, yeah, in a short way. I think that the green transformation. Again, people might say the green revolution did increase productivity, agriculture, and again maybe led to rural poverty declines and so on. But that was some time back, of course, we know, right? And then after that, there's been a systematic underinvestment in public investment in agriculture. There has been really no reorganization of land holdings. We have a highly unequal landholding structure in India, right? No land reforms, systematic land reforms has happened. And also, if you look at, if you think of South Korea was in a roughly same stage as India, in 1950s. And South Korea, there's a massive educational program, human capital investments that happened along with land reform, of course, right? I think that created a base. And same thing in China, one could also argue. They created a base so that even when the workers moving for agriculture, they left for cities with some skills and some education. In China, the workers who showed up in the cities in Shanghai and so on and so forth, they had sufficient level of education skills, because manufacturing you cannot do if you don't have certain levels of skill, right? So that they had, right? South Korea also had. So maybe the failure in India was not investing enough at the early stage in education and skills in the rural workforce, right? Now, of course, education has increased, and primary education certainly increased. Secondary education, not yet in rural areas, right? Still a huge problem to get access to a secondary school. The school may be miles away if you're living in a village somewhere where there is no secondary school close by. So there are those challenges also, which has not been really fully addressed, even now. But I take your point that green transformation would look promising in the with the Green Revolution, 1960s, 1970s, so on. could not really fulfill its potential now, right? And there are many reasons why that might have happened. I think also, as Das mentioned, infrastructure too, and so on. I mean, it's interesting to me that maybe what we have seen recently with this big road building program in rural areas is creating this construction work. I mean, that's what I wanted to look at it a bit more closely. That construction employment, where is it coming from? That I don't have yet the data. I want to look at that a bit more carefully because maybe this big road building things are going on, rural roads and so on. It's creating jobs for a lot of these workers in the rural areas, apart from jobs created in construction sites in cities, right? But that is not really, that kind of work is fine, but it's stopgap work, right? And so there is an argument that that work is also not going to be leading to a more productive economic transformation, right? So yeah, I take your point. There's a lot of thought. One needs to think a bit more about the agrarian transformation not happening. I mean, the point I made at the very beginning of one of my earlier slides that ultimately the agricultural productivity growth is a crucial driver of sector transformation. Because when that happens, workers get released, right? You don't need as many workers, and of course, then they will go to other sectors in the economy. So that has not happened in India, China, South. All of these countries that have seen social transformation, there was massive increase in agricultural productivity at the beginning of that stage, which hasn't really happened in India after the initial years of the Green Revolution. Hopefully, I answered your very difficult question.
No, no, thank you very much.
Any more questions? Or otherwise, Professor, I think the president can now take over. I don't see any more questions. So I think with this, I move out of the scene, and I think I request the president, Dr. Jugal Mahapatra, to kindly make his remarks and conduct the proceeding. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Keshav Babu, and thank you, Dr. Sen, for an extremely illuminating lecture. I think almost every participant in this seminar has really enjoyed and appreciated. They have really got insights into what's happening across different countries in comparable state of economic development, as well as what's happening in India. I had just one, I entirely agree with almost everything you have said. I think the policy, as Prabhakar Babu said, many of these issues are also the in-house knowledge within the government. I think even in Niti Aayog, they have been doing it. Their own member agriculture has written a paper why a Lewisian model has not worked in India. I think the two things that might really help in this thing, and a lot of hard work, and they are not free of challenges. One is this shift to manufacturing based on PLI and the global value chain, joining the global value chain. That's the policy thrust is there. And the China plus one that's happening, and that's a geopolitical factor that's influencing. But that again requires a supportive trade policy, and that's something is and I don't know. There are questions about whether India's trade policy is aligned to this kind of a goal, this kind of a mandate. So that is an issue. The second thing that I would like to mention is that the policy should focus not only in creation of non-agricultural jobs, it should focus on decent work. And if we focus on decent work, the issues relating to construction sector, underproductive, low productivity, lack of social security, and all that will be addressed. Unfortunately, we have large corpus of fund which has been generated to the assess on construction projects, and much of it remains unspent. And this was entirely meant for providing social security for construction sector workers. That's not happened. So along with skilling, social protection, more serious trade policy alignment for taking, that India's mandate to increase manufacturing to 25%. All these are pathways for us to achieve a more desirable structural transformation. But that's easier said than done. But you have done a commendable job by educating all of us about what needs to be done and how difficult it is. Thank you so much.
I completely agree with you. I absolutely agree what you said. Thank you so much.
Okay. So at the end, I would like to thank again Professor Kunal Sen for educating us. And although the issue of structural transformation is a very old debate, but then you have given a very new flavor to this debate. And so thank you very much for spending your time with us and educating all our members of Odisha Economic Association and also the outside the association. And also, I was really happy to know that you had frequently interacted with Professor Misra, and so thank you so much. Then I would like to thank Professor Kesav Das for connecting with you, and that's how we could gain from your knowledge. And so thank you, Professor Kesav Das, the editor-in-chief of the Odisha Economic Journal and the former president. And also I thank the president of Odisha Economic Association, Dr. Jugal Mahapatra, for presiding over this meeting and also sharing his inputs and providing us this leadership. And I thank all the participants who could join with us, and all the participants who asked a lot of questions, so that I think we have already exceeded the time. So we had a very interactive session. So I thank all of you for joining this meeting. So with this, we may close. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Namaste.